Morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Bishop Harada, for the invitation and for introducing me. Thank you, Kenji Sensei, for your generative vision of the benefits of a life of gratitude. And I also want to thank the members of the Living Dharma Committee and everyone who worked to make this event come to fruition. So as we know, the beauty and the challenge of Shin Buddhism is to open our hearts and minds to really experience the teachings in our daily life. So I'd like to share with you my understanding of some of the benefits of our tradition through some stories from my life in three parts. Some of you have heard some of these stories already. Some of you might be hearing them for the first time, but I sincerely hope they resonate in some way. So, like many newcomers to Buddhism, I found myself at the doorstep of a BCA temple, the San Fernando Valley Honganji Buddhist Temple, at a time of crisis that actually unexpectedly helped me better understand myself. So, for me, one of the first benefits is the benefit of finding Shin Buddhism, finding myself, and really coming to understand the true self. So about 10 years ago, I was busy at work writing my dissertation all about the history of Los Angeles's San Fernando Valley region. Whether or not you've been to the Valley, I'm sure you've had some connection to the Valley in some way, shape, or form. Maybe it's because you, as a young person, listened to the music of Richie Valens. Maybe you remember the really funny sitcom, The George Lopez Show. And so all of these parts of this neighborhood's history were things that I was exploring as I tried to understand the deeper histories of communities of color in the San Fernando Valley, particularly one neighborhood called Pacoima, which was the home to communities of color that historically had been excluded and segregated from the rest of the San Fernando Valley. And in researching that, this land of restrictive covenants and racist lending practices, but also learning about a rich history of communities of color, including many Japanese Americans, I was so surprised as a scholar to learn that there was a nearly 100-year-old Buddhist temple in this neighborhood. And as I dug deeper, learning more about the history of the members of what eventually became the San Fernando Valley Honganji Buddhist Temple, learning about the stories of tilling the soil in this harsh land, learning about pooling money to build the first hondo, I realized I was actually getting called back to the temple in very unexpected ways. That the more I asked about the history of the temple, the more I found myself asking about, well, what were these people learning about on Sunday mornings? What was the meaning behind these festivals, such as the two images of Obon you see in front of you? And I think part of the reason I was drawn to the temple, both as an intellectual curiosity, but on a more deeper spiritual journey, was I was living a life of great uncertainty as I was finishing my dissertation. For any of you who are familiar with higher education, the world of the professor, the person who immerses themselves in the world of ideas, creating change through their writing and being a part of the mechanisms of social transformation, is a really exciting process. But because of all sorts of circumstances beyond what we can talk about today, the pool of people who get those jobs is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. You see here this headline from nothing less than the New York Times talking about the bleak landscape of people with PhDs, people who are some of the most highly educated people. And so this was the world I was entering into. I had worked so hard expecting this path, and it didn't come to fruition. And I bounced from one job teaching at UC Santa Barbara to another job teaching at UCLA to another job teaching at Cal State Long Beach. And over time, I was growing more and more frustrated that, again, this path that I had worked so assiduously for was not coming true. But as I said, the more I was racking up miles driving to UC Santa Barbara or Long Beach, the more I kept finding myself being pulled back to that temple. And as I started to ask my friends who are members of the temple those questions, they said, well, why don't you just come and experience it for yourself? Why don't you sit in on our Saturday Dharma discussions, which was a gateway to becoming a member? Those Saturday Dharma discussions were so wonderful. They were led by our resident minister, Reverend Patty Usuki, who many of you know. And in these discussion groups where no question was too big or too small, I was able to learn some important things that motivated me to become a member and eventually pursue this path. I learned fundamentally new insights into who I am. I learned that, yeah, so much of that suffering of not getting that one path had to do with the fact I'm a person driven by my ego that is deeply angry because life didn't turn out the way I expected it to be. That I'm a person clinging to that vision when in fact that vision of what life that I thought should be was actually holding me back from experiencing something far richer. I learned, and especially because I was raised nominally Catholic, that yes, I was driven by my ego. Yes, I was filled with anger. Yes, I was filled with clinging. That didn't make me a sinner, as folks in Christianity might think. It just made me a human being. It made me someone who could feel much compassion for people going through the exact same experiences. And so significantly, what I learned that has become a true benefit for me is, yes, I am all those things, and I truly am the unconditional benefit or unconditional recipient of the benefits of all life working together. It reminds me of that teaching of Nishu Jinshin that we, realize our imperfect selves and at the same time immediately realize that we are grasped by a web of all life. And so with that view, I was able to not look back in sadness or anger that my title is not assistant professor of something somewhere, but I was able to look back fondly, realizing what was there all along. And it wasn't loss. It wasn't a life that did not come to fruition. It was lifelong friends who supported me through thick and thin. It was literally thousands of students who made me a better person, who taught me lessons about intellectual curiosity, about being myself. What was there all along were the conditions to lead me to UC Santa Barbara, where I met the love of my life. And here's a beautiful picture of us from our wedding, officiated by Reverend Patty Usuki. But this brings me to this quotation that has always stuck with me from one of Shinran's teachers, Honen. He wrote, "There is no place the moon does not shine, but it only illuminates in the heart of those who gaze at it." So one very important benefit for me is to create the mindset to seek out the moonlight that is always shining upon me. Part 2. Related to that is a new understanding for me of how to experience the wonder and the awe and even the mystery in everyday life. So if you Google interdependence, you get these images of interconnection, of linkages. But what I have learned, as I continue to learn, is that interdependence is not just that we're connected. It's not just there are these what a small world moments, but truly that all life is calling out to us and working towards us. And it reminds me of the attitude that I've learned from our temple elders of Okage-sama Day, that I am because of you. And even more to the point, I am well because of you. And so being able to approach the awe and the wonder and the mystery of everyday life really came to me one summer when I was researching the history of UCLA's Asian American Studies Center. Asian American Studies, as many of us might know, is part of the ethnic studies tradition, which centers the experiences of minoritized and historically excluded and marginalized people like Asian Americans, African Americans, Latinos. to understand their lives and their histories and their communities. And I was an Asian American Studies major in college. I went on to get a master's degree in Asian American Studies. And as Reverend Harada pointed out, I still actually teach Asian American Studies part-time. So this is a very precious gift for me. And in doing the research of the Asian American Studies Center, I discovered all sorts of histories of, hard-fought activism, young people imagining a new tomorrow, people fighting against the Vietnam War, and how it affected all sorts of people, and also how young people wanted to give back to their communities. It was tough. It was inspirational, but it was also tough. And so the reason I made this very dramatic change to these images of exercise is, as I was doing that research in the archives, my respite, because this was like a full-time job in the archives, my respite was exercise. A really wonderful exercise class at UCLA for faculty and staff, where we lifted weights and we ran and we did things with names like cleans and push presses and floor presses and deadlifts. And it was a really nice distraction from the hard work of archival research. It was a nice distraction from the hard work of learning about some very, very difficult stories of racism and oppression and things like that. And one of the people I got to know in this exercise class was a very respected seismologist that we called Earthquakes Dave Jackson, who was, I later found out, a very distinguished seismologist. He was actually one of the experts who testified before Congress after the 1994 Northridge earthquake. But for me, he was just a really friendly guy that shared a barbell with me. And we would chat and have a good time. But eventually the archives called me back. So I went back to the archives, and in one day, I discovered that this moment at UCLA occurred where this very draconian, very harsh new administration wanted to scrap all of these ethnic studies classes that were central to the Asian American Studies program. These were innovative, dynamic classes that had never been taught anywhere before. But this new administration insisted that they be cut. And as I kept turning page after page in the archives, I started to find more voices of support, largely from Asian American faculty, Asian American students. But shockingly, I found a report in these heady days of the 1960s and 70s that criticized the administration's decision. And this report, called a minority report, was written by the one dissenting member of that committee that voted to scrap all of those classes. That minority report said, if you look at the screen, I hope to establish first that these courses belong at UCLA. Second, I will argue that the process in which the Asian American Studies Center have selected instructors is sound and consistent with UCLA practice. And I thought to myself, wow, I wonder who this person could have been. And you probably know where I'm going with this. This report, published in 1974, was published by Professor David Jackson, my workout buddy. I had no clue that I could be tied to a workout buddy across time and space with such rich karmic circumstances. And again, we might think that this is just a nice, oh, well, it's a small world story. But I'd like to think that this actually is illustrative of interdependence, because Asian American studies, as I mentioned, has truly changed my life. Asian American studies has led me to my intellectual curiosities. It's led me to communities. It's led me to write a dissertation about the San Fernando Valley, which included learning more about the San Fernando Valley Honganji Buddhist Temple. So this story brings together all of these different karmic circumstances that make me who I am. It reminds me of the words of Shinran, who wrote in the Shoshinge, pure light, joyful light, the light of wisdom, light constant, inconceivable, light beyond speaking, Light surpassing sun and moon is sent forth, illuminating countless worlds. The multitudes of beings all receive this radiance. And so what I love about this story is it reminds me about all of the different rays of light that were shining upon me so I could live the life that I can. And Dave, that workout buddy, who 40 years earlier was balancing raising a family, getting grants, teaching classes, doing his research, felt compelled by the light that was shining upon him to do what was right and stand up for those classes. And though very sadly, Dave passed away very unexpectedly a few months ago, this is one of those stories that I hold so dearly. But to conclude, I want to return to where I began, with the benefit of Sangha. I talked about finding myself, finding a new worldview, and I want to end with finding a new community. A community of people that when I first started to join the temple seemed so disconnected to me. These are people of a different ethnicity, of a different background, of a different generation. But as Reverend Usuki would read the Shotsky lists and impel us to think about how we are connected to those people, that started to help me think about across time and space. These people gave so much to live the teachings of joyful compassion, to live the teachings of paying it forward. And as I scratch the surface deeper, to learn about how the people you see in these photos survived war, survived dislocation, by being nourished by the teachings, inspired me to want to learn more, inspired me to want to give back. It inspired me to want to pursue this path. This Sangha was there, providing mutual care and concern in some of the harshest times in recent life, joyfully, happily, learning how to use Zoom, learning how to mute ourselves, learning how to spotlight ourselves. And as we came out of the Zoom pandemic, and I started to pursue the Tokudo path, which I know has been laid by all of the people I've spoken about and so many more, I began to fully understand the meaning of Sangha and fully understand the deep, sincere gratitude that comes from understanding the true love that people have shined upon me, a complete newcomer, because they have realized all that they have received. And so I want to close with this image of our 100th anniversary, which we had to postpone because of the pandemic. And even though there are just, scores of people pictured there, it reminds me to go back to an earlier theme of the mystery and the awe and the wonder that comes from thinking about each of those people's stories and how I am able to receive so much precisely because of all of them and precisely because of all of you for making this possible. So thank you all so much for allowing me to share my thoughts.